Blackwell ruled empires with a glance. Men feared his silence more than bullets. Cities bent quietly to his will. But inside his own house, something far more dangerous had taken root: absence. Celine drifted through the marble halls of Blackwell's estate like a ghost, surrounded by wealth that glittered but never warmed. Chandeliers burned bright over empty rooms. Gifts arrived daily, flawless and meaningless. And every tick of the clock echoed the same truth. Love had been replaced with luxury, presence with power. Blackwell believed he provided everything a family could need: security, status, protection. What he never noticed was what he withheld. Their daughter, Lyra, noticed. Children hear the things adults refuse to say aloud: the silence after unanswered words, the ache behind polite smiles, the way a house can feel heavy even when it's full. Lyra watched her mother grow quieter. She watched her father grow distant. And somewhere between bedtime stories and whispered tears, she made a decision no one else dared to make. This is not a story about a mafia boss losing control. It's about a child who walked into a room full of monsters and told the most powerful one the truth. And that truth would cost him everything he thought he was. If you're hooked, stay with me till the very end of the story. Don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe button, drop a comment, and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. I've got so many incredible stories coming your way, and you definitely don't want to miss any of them. Alright, let's get back to the story. Celine moved through the vast corridors of Blackwell's estate as though she were a ghost. Every surface gleamed, marble floors reflecting crystal chandeliers, oil paintings of ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow her with faint judgment. The air smelled faintly of sandalwood and money, a fragrance that should have comforted her, but instead made the silence echo louder. Every door she passed led to rooms filled with treasures: a grand piano that had never been played, walls lined with first editions of books she would never read, and closets bursting with gowns that shimmered like liquid gold. Yet none of it could fill the quiet that pressed against her chest like a physical weight. In the sitting room, she lowered herself onto a velvet chaise and let her fingers trace the intricate patterns embroidered into the fabric. The house was breathtaking, every detail meticulously curated to display wealth and power, yet it was a cage, and she had been its prisoner for years. She glanced at the clock on the mantel, precious seconds ticking away in a life she sometimes wondered if she still truly lived. Each tick reminded her of the conversations she hadn't had, the laughter that never filled the hallways, and the touch of a hand she craved but seldom felt. Blackwell was a man who ruled the world beyond these walls, yet inside, he remained a stranger, a figure of authority she could admire but never embrace. Her eyes fell on a photograph of her daughter, Lyra, perched on the piano like a tiny sunbeam, smiling at a world Celine could barely see. Even in her innocence, Lyra sensed the distance between her parents, the unspoken walls that separated them. Celine's lips pressed into a thin line, not from anger, but from exhaustion, from the slow erosion of hope. Blackwell's gifts, jewels, clothes, an endless parade of servants, were impressive, but they were also a constant reminder of what she had lost. Emotional connection was the currency she truly desired, yet it had been denied, exchanged instead for polished surfaces and empty gestures. She rose and wandered toward the balcony, the city sprawling beneath her like a jeweled carpet. The night was alive with lights and movement. With the sound of life, she felt only as a distant echo. The breeze lifted her hair, brushing against her cheek. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine a different world, one where laughter was not replaced by silence, where love was not measured in wealth or fear. She pressed her hand against the cold stone railing, wishing she could reach through the walls of the house, through the walls of Blackwell's heart, and pull him closer, if only for a moment. A soft noise drew her attention to the doorway, where Lyra stood, small and observant, her eyes reflecting a quiet understanding that often startled Celine. The child's presence was a balm and a reminder. Life still existed beyond this gilded cage, and hope, fragile as it was, had not yet abandoned them. Celine knelt to embrace her daughter, holding her tightly, feeling the warmth of something real, something alive. For the first time that evening, the weight of the house seemed a little less suffocating, though the loneliness remained, a shadow lurking in the corners, waiting for the moment when it could be confronted. Celine waited in the doorway, the soft click of her heels muted against the marble floor. Blackwell's office smelled of polished wood and cigar smoke, an aroma that had become synonymous with authority and distance. He sat behind the massive mahogany desk, fingers steepled, eyes fixed on a series of papers that barely held his attention. His posture was impeccable, every line of his body a declaration of control, of unshakable command. Celine's voice, when it emerged, was tentative, like a bird testing the wind. "Thaddeus, can we talk?" she said, keeping her tone gentle, careful. She stepped forward, her hands clasped in front of her, trying to anchor herself against the tide of tension that always seemed to swell in his presence. About how things have been." He didn't look up. Instead, he adjusted his cufflinks, a small, deliberate movement that signaled the distance he always maintained. He murmured, a sound that weighed like a door closing. Celine swallowed and moved a fraction closer. "I feel like we were drifting. I know you provide for us, and I don't." She stopped herself, struggling to find words that would pierce the walls he had built around himself. "I don't need more things, Thaddeus. I need you. Just here. Listening. Talking. Being present." He finally lifted his gaze, checking his watch as if the conversation were a minor inconvenience, a distraction from the clockwork of his life. His dark eyes, sharp and unreadable, met hers for a fleeting second. Then he reached into the drawer of his desk and pulled out a sleek, black credit card. The motion was slow, deliberate, precise, the kind of gesture that had ended countless arguments before they began. "For what?" Celine asked, her voice trembling despite her best effort to remain composed. "For anything you need," he said flatly, placing the card on the polished surface in front of her. "Anything you want." Celine's hands hovered over the card, a strange emptiness settling into her chest. She had expected dismissal, yes, but the gesture felt colder than any harsh word. It was a statement of distance disguised as generosity, a reminder that in his world, love was measured in currency, in gifts and protection, never in presence or understanding. She looked at him, searching for a flicker of recognition, a sign that he heard more than just the polite tremor in her voice. But his eyes had already returned to the papers, to the calculations and arrangements that consumed him. The click of a pen punctuated the silence, a final, irrevocable note that the conversation had ended before it even began. Celine turned slowly, the weight of the gesture pressing down on her, and walked back toward the hallway. Her steps were quiet, measured, carrying the subtle ache of resignation. Behind her, the office remained as it always had, imposing, untouchable, a realm where she could never truly enter. And somewhere down the hall, Lyra watched, her small frame pressed against the wall, absorbing every motion, every inflection, understanding more than her years should allow. The seed of courage had been planted, silent and small, waiting for the moment it would bloom. Lyra crept through the house with the quiet precision only a child could muster, her small feet barely making a sound against the marble floors. The laughter she sometimes imagined her mother used to make seemed a distant echo here, muffled and fragile. She followed the faint rustle of fabric and the soft, uneven sniffles that had become all too familiar in recent months. The garden doors were slightly ajar, and a warm glow of late afternoon sunlight spilled across the stone pathway, illuminating the neat rows of roses that her mother tended with a care that seemed almost ritualistic. There, at the far end of the garden, Celine knelt on the ground, her face buried in her hands. The rich scent of soil mixed with a faint perfume lingering in her hair, a bittersweet combination that tugged at Lyra's chest. The child stopped for a moment, hidden behind a marble pillar, and watched. Celine's shoulders shook gently, a tremor that spoke of heartbreak and exhaustion far deeper than Lyra could fully understand. Her mother's quiet sobs were almost swallowed by the rustling leaves, yet they were enough for Lyra to feel the gravity of the sadness, like a stone settling heavily in her small stomach. Lyra's brow furrowed, her tiny hands clenching instinctively. She had seen her mother smile, had seen the warmth that could fill the room when Daddy was elsewhere, but now it was as if the air itself had thickened with the absence of something essential. She didn't know the exact words for it, but the ache in her mother's heart was unmistakable. Slowly, the realization began to bloom in her mind, a quiet, terrifying truth. Daddy was the reason for this. The man who seemed invincible, untouchable, and feared by everyone around him. The man who made his office shake with authority was also the one who made her mommy cry. Lyra's small chest heaved as the understanding settled in. The monsters in her storybooks were nothing compared to this one, who wore a tailored suit and spoke in calm, controlled tones. This was the kind of monster that didn't roar or snarl. It ruled in silence, in absence, in the subtle dismissal of love and presence. And yet, unlike the creatures in her bedtime stories, she could see him, could see his face and hear his voice. This monster wasn't mythical. It was real. It was Daddy. The child's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't want her mother to feel this sadness anymore, didn't want the ache that settled into the lines of Celine's face, or the way her eyes seemed to lose their light. She tiptoed closer, the sun catching her hair like a halo, a small beacon against the vast shadow of the house and the invisible walls it held. "Mommy," Lyra whispered, her voice barely louder than the wind. Celine's head lifted slightly, her eyes red and glistening, and for a fleeting moment, Lyra saw the recognition of shared pain. In that instant, Lyra understood her purpose, though she didn't yet know how she would fulfill it. She would protect Mommy from the invisible weight, even if it meant confronting the monster that everyone else feared to name. From the corner of the garden, Lyra made her decision, her small fingers curling into determined fists. Daddy had built a world of power, but she would find a way to build a bridge into his heart, or tear the walls down herself. The boardroom was a fortress of glass and steel, the city skyline stretching beyond it like a silent witness. Blackwell sat at the head of the long table, the polished surface reflecting the sharp angles of his jaw and the cold glint in his eyes. Around him, men who owed their lives and their loyalty hung on every word, every subtle inflection of tone. The rival across from him, a man with a reputation for ruthlessness nearly equal to his own, leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. The air between them was taut, a thread stretched so fine it could snap with a single misstep. "You understand the terms," Blackwell said, voice measured, each syllable deliberate, controlled. His gaze swept the room, the men around him absorbing his presence, like shadows under a moonless sky. "Any deviation, and we both know the consequences." The rival chuckled, low and dangerous, tapping a finger against the table. "Consequences are inevitable in our world, Thaddeus. But let's be honest, the only thing you fear is losing control." Blackwell's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the polished veneer of diplomacy cracked, revealing the predator beneath. Silence fell like a weight, pressing against the ribs of everyone in the room. A single cough from a bodyguard sounded deafening, a small misstep magnified in the pressure chamber of authority and threat. The rival's smirk faltered, a flicker of unease passing over his features. Blackwell did not flinch. He had built his empire on intimidation, on the understanding that fear was a language everyone understood, and today's conversation was no different. Documents slid across the table, contracts filled with terms written in ink as black as the suits they wore. Blackwell's fingers tapped a slow, rhythmic pattern on the table, an unspoken metronome counting down seconds that felt like lifetimes. Around him, his men shifted, alert and ready, each movement a study in silent obedience. Outside the boardroom, the hum of the city continued, unaware of the tension that held the air captive in this room, unaware that a single word could ignite chaos. The rival leaned forward, attempting to regain control, his eyes flicking toward Blackwell with a mixture of calculation and veiled threat. "And the territory?" he asked, voice smooth but edged with steel. "Surely you don't intend to cede this without a fight." Blackwell's smile was slight, cold, and without warmth. "I do not fight where there is no need," he replied. "But do not mistake patience for weakness." His words were measured, but the weight behind them was undeniable, a promise of repercussions, unspoken yet terrifyingly clear. The room seemed to shrink, every breath taut with anticipation. Even the men at the periphery of the table felt the lethal charge in the air, a current of danger that could strike without warning. Every handshake, every nod, was calculated, a subtle ballet of power and threat. In this room, loyalty and fear intertwined, and Blackwell moved through it all like a predator among prey, untouchable, unyielding, yet just beneath the surface, the cold echo of something he had long ignored, the fragility of the walls around the family waiting outside, the quiet tension that could no longer be dismissed. The heavy doors of the boardroom groaned open, a sound so ordinary it might have gone unnoticed, except for the small figure standing in the threshold. Lyra, barely 5, clutched the crumpled drawing to her chest, her tiny shoulders squared with a resolve that seemed impossible for someone so small. The sunlight from the hallway spilled across her hair, making her look impossibly fragile and impossibly determined at the same time. For a heartbeat, the room froze. The guards, seasoned men who had faced threats ranging from gunmen to assassins, stared with mouths slightly open. No one had trained for this. No protocol existed for a child stepping into the epicenter of Blackwell's authority. Their hands twitched toward their holsters instinctively, then faltered, unsure whether to act or stand frozen in awe. Lyra's gaze swept the room, landing finally on her father, who sat at the head of the table like a dark king surveying his court. Blackwell's eyes, sharp and commanding, narrowed. "Lyra," he said, a note of disbelief cutting through the hum of tension. "What?" He paused, the words failing him, because nothing in his world had prepared him for this. His daughter, small and insistent, standing unafraid in a room designed for power and menace. Lyra took a tentative step forward, then another, each movement deliberate. The crumpled paper in her hand trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady. "Daddy," she said, her voice soft yet clear, carrying through the thick air like a bell tolling in the night. "You need to listen." The words were simple, almost childlike, yet the room seemed to catch on their weight. They were a hammer striking the crystal of his authority, reverberating through the men who had sworn loyalty to him, leaving them suspended in a mixture of fear, confusion, and awe. Blackwell's rivals, seated across the table, exchanged uneasy glances. Some smirked nervously, unsure whether to laugh or seize advantage. But the cold certainty in Lyra's tone, the fearless tilt of her chin, made even them hesitate. The threat she posed was intangible yet undeniable, a force they could not measure with guns, contracts, or fear. For a moment, the Mafia boss's carefully constructed world teetered. He felt the tug of two realities at once, the lethal, calculated persona he wore like armor and the fragile, aching vulnerability of the child who had followed him into this fortress of power. No amount of strategy or intimidation could erase the truth in her eyes. She was the messenger of everything he had ignored, the mirror reflecting the consequences of his emotional absence. The guards remained rooted, torn between duty and instinct, and Lyra stepped closer. The crumpled drawing unfolded in her hands, a small, bright emblem of innocence in the shadows of the room. "Daddy," she repeated, louder this time. "You have to listen to Mommy." The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to ignore. Blackwell's hand twitched, a reflex born from decades of control, but his gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. The room remained tense, lethal with unspoken potential, yet it was no longer a battlefield of money and power. Something far more dangerous had entered, a child's courage, unfiltered and unrelenting, demanding a reckoning that no contract or threat could prevent. And for the first time that day, the Mafia boss felt truly seen. Lyra stood in the center of the boardroom, the drawing still clutched tightly in her small hands. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the space between her and her father. Blackwell's dark eyes bore into her, sharp, calculating, a predator assessing a threat. Around them, the men in the room shifted uneasily, the silence stretching, taut as a drawn bowstring. The rival across the table leaned back, curiosity flickering across his face, as if waiting to see whether the child would crumble under the weight of power or break it. Lyra drew in a steadying breath, her small chest rising with determination that belied her age. She remembered the cold, clipped tone he had used when dismissing her mother earlier that day, the way he had brushed Celine off with a credit card instead of words, instead of presence. She had heard it over and over, in gestures, in silences, in the way his authority filled every corner of their lives. And now, she would use it back. "Are you too busy?" she began, her voice small but precise, carrying a weight that startled even her. "To be a husband?" The words were clipped, formal, almost a command, echoing the sharp cadence he used with his subordinates. They sliced through the air like a knife, cutting through the tension of negotiations and the subtle games of intimidation. The room fell into stillness, so complete it felt as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Blackwell's jaw tightened, the briefest flicker of something unrecognizable passing across his face, shock, disbelief, maybe even guilt. His fingers tapped the polished surface of the table, a subtle attempt to regain control, but the rhythm faltered, broken by the weight of the mirror Lyra held up for him. Around him, the men exchanged cautious glances, their loyalties tested in a way no gun or contract ever had. The rival's smirk faltered, replaced by a tense curiosity. The child's words, simple as they were, had shifted the dynamics of the room. Power, fear, and authority, all the elements that had seemed absolute, had been undermined by the pure, unflinching clarity of a child. Blackwell's eyes softened, just slightly, as he leaned back in his chair. The armor he wore so carefully began to crack, the edges of the mask fraying under the weight of truth he had long ignored. This small figure, so fearless in the face of men who would have killed for a glance, reflected everything he had been too blind, or too proud, to see. Lyra stepped closer, holding up her drawing like a shield and a beacon. "Mommy, she needs you. She needs you to listen." The words were deliberate, exacting, and yet they carried the warmth and urgency that only a child could muster. For the first time in years, Blackwell did not speak over her, did not issue a command or dismiss the intrusion. He simply stared unblinking, as if seeing not just the child before him, but the life he had been too absorbed in power to fully live. And in that silence, the truth settled, heavy and undeniable. He had been given a choice, and this time, the mirror demanded he look. The rival's laughter cut through the silence like a blade, sharp and cruel, bouncing off the polished walls of the boardroom. A few others followed with low, mocking chuckles, their eyes glinting with the dangerous mix of amusement and disbelief. They had seen Blackwell unshaken by threats, unflinching in the face of assassins and betrayal, and yet here he sat, unmoving, stripped of the armor he wore so naturally. His aura, once absolute and lethal, wavered under the weight of a child's gaze. Blackwell's hands rested on the table, fingers curling slightly, betraying a tension he rarely allowed anyone to see. The mask of the Mafia boss, the calculated, untouchable figure that had built empires and commanded fear, was cracking. The edges splintered with each soft step Lyra took forward, each word she spoke. The clipped cadence of authority she had learned from him now turned back upon him like a mirror. He could feel the weight of his own neglect in the hollow pause of her small voice, in the way she did not bow, did not cower, did not blink. The room was a storm of whispers and sharp glances. The rivals leaned forward, sensing the fracture, hungry for weakness, ready to exploit the subtle tremor they now perceived. Blackwell's men stiffened, some readying themselves, not for defense against an external threat, but against the invisible breach that had penetrated their leader's composure. Every inch of the office seemed to shrink, contracting around the truth that now filled the space. Lyra raised her drawing, holding it like a banner of defiance and hope. "Daddy," she said, the single word carrying an intensity far beyond her years. "You promised to be here. You promised to listen." Her voice, though small, rang with the weight of observation, of judgment, of love tempered by disappointment. Blackwell could feel the mirror of her words pressing against his chest, forcing him to see himself not as the untouchable Dawn he had always believed he was, but as a man who had failed in the quietest, most intimate ways. For the first time, he sensed what his presence, or lack thereof, had done to his family. The hollow spaces in Celine's eyes, the tension in her shoulders, the silent suffering he had dismissed as trivial, they all coalesced into a single, undeniable truth. And here was Lyra, tiny but unyielding, reflecting back every mistake he had buried beneath wealth, fear, and control. The laughter around him continued, but it no longer held power over him. The threat of the rival's mockery felt distant, almost irrelevant, compared to the reality that pressed against his heart. His dark eyes softened, and for a fleeting moment, the predator gave way to a man who could feel, who could acknowledge the pain he had caused. Blackwell's lips parted, almost imperceptibly, as he leaned back, letting the mask slip further. The room, once a stage for dominance and negotiation, had become a crucible of reckoning. And through it all, Lyra remained unwavering, the small figure who had dared to shatter his carefully constructed world with nothing more than courage, truth, and a child's insistence that love, at its core, could not be ignored. Blackwell rose from his chair, the movement slow and deliberate, a shift in gravity that rippled through the room. The rivals stiffened, their smiles fading as they registered the change in his demeanor. The lethal edge that had defined him moments before was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar, almost fragile. He lifted a hand, and the men around the table froze, waiting for a command that would send them into calculated violence. But the gesture that followed was not one of aggression. It was a dismissal. "Leave," he said, voice low, carrying a weight that brooked no argument. His gaze swept over the men in the room, measuring their loyalty, their hesitation, their fear. "All of you." The guards and lieutenants hesitated for barely a heartbeat, caught between protocol and instinct. Then, slowly, they began to rise, shuffling toward the doors, their expressions a mixture of confusion and awe. Outside, the rival and his entourage lingered for a moment, uncertain, before the realization hit that the empire they had thought unshakable had just shifted under their feet. Blackwell had chosen a path they could not predict, not dominance, not strategy, not retaliation, but something far more powerful: humanity. Lyra stepped closer, her small hand trembling slightly as she reached up. Blackwell bent down, letting her tiny fingers curl around his own, the contrast of their sizes stark against the polished wood and steel of the boardroom. The child's eyes met his, wide and unwavering, and for a moment, he let himself simply be present, without authority, without threat, without calculation. "Come," he said, voice quieter now, almost gentle, the cadence of command softened by the pull of something he had ignored for too long. Lyra nodded, her grip tightening, and together they moved toward the massive doors. Each step echoed with purpose, a rhythm of resolve that neither fear nor power could silence. The city beyond the glass walls shimmered with lights, oblivious to the quiet revolution unfolding in the tower above. Blackwell's mind, usually so focused on strategy, dominance, and survival, was now occupied entirely with a different mission: to find Celine, to close the distance that his neglect had allowed to grow, to right a wrong he had long considered unchangeable. He pushed through the doors into the hallways of his estate, the familiar grandeur now reframed in stark contrast to the life that had been waiting behind closed doors. Every corridor, every chandelier, every silent servant reminded him of the time lost, of the cold walls he had built around the people he loved most. Lyra's small hand in his was a compass, a tether guiding him toward what truly mattered, toward the woman whose quiet suffering had become impossible to ignore. As they approached the bedroom where Celine had retreated, Blackwell paused at the threshold. He inhaled, the scent of sandalwood and memory filling his senses. For the first time, he did not see a wife to impress or a family to protect with money and fear. He saw her, the heart he had ignored, the presence he had denied, the love that had always been there waiting. Lyra tugged gently, and together they stepped inside, leaving behind the empire, the rivalries, and the illusions of control. In that space, all that remained was the truth he had long evaded, the simple, terrifying, transformative act of listening. Blackwell paused outside the bedroom door, the familiar weight of authority and expectation pressing against his shoulders. His hand hovered over the handle for a heartbeat longer than necessary, as if the simple act of crossing the threshold required more courage than any deal, any threat, any calculated maneuver he had ever faced. In the hall behind him, the empire continued its indifferent hum, the staff moving silently, the walls echoing his presence. But here, at this door, all of it was irrelevant. The contracts, the negotiations, the calculated threats, all meaningless compared to the fragile, living truth waiting on the other side. He set his phone down on the small table by the door, deliberately leaving it behind. No alerts, no messages. No empire could intrude on this moment. It was the first conscious choice he had made in years to prioritize presence over duty, love over strategy. Lyra, sensing the weight of the gesture, squeezed his hand, small and insistent, guiding him forward. Inside, Celine sat on the edge of the bed, her hair falling softly around her face, the faint traces of tears still glistening on her cheeks. She looked up as the door opened, startled first by his presence, then by the absence of the usual shield he carried, the phone, the watchful eyes, the impenetrable persona. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she saw him as he truly was, not the feared Blackwell, the untouchable Mafia Don, but a man stripped of pretense, willing to step into the quiet vulnerability of his own family. Lyra slipped from his hand and ran to her mother, throwing herself into Celine's embrace with the urgent sincerity only a child could manage. Blackwell remained at the doorway, his dark eyes softening, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to let the room breathe. He took a step forward, then another, until he was close enough to see the faint lines of exhaustion in Celine's face, the quiet sadness that had lingered too long. He sank onto the edge of the bed, deliberately lowering himself to meet them in their space, to remove the divide that had grown insurmountable over years of distance and neglect. His voice, when it finally emerged, was low, deliberate, and unshakably sincere.
"I'm listening."
The words, simple and unadorned, carried a weight that no gesture, no gift, no promise of wealth or protection had ever achieved. It was acknowledgement, it was presence, it was a bridge he had refused to build until now. Celine's eyes widened, disbelief mingling with a fragile hope she had almost forgotten, and she reached out, placing her hand over his. Lyra nestled against her mother, watching the first true connection in months unfold, her small heart swelling with quiet triumph. For the first time, the house felt less like a cage and more like home. The city outside continued its indifferent rhythm, but inside this room, time seemed to pause, allowing a father to finally see, a mother to finally be heard, and a daughter to finally know that the walls built by fear and neglect could be dismantled, not with violence or command, but with courage, honesty, and a simple act of listening.